Welcome, everyone, to our January 19th, 2023 session of the IDEA sessions, sponsored by the Missouri Alliance for Arts Education. IDEA refers to inclusion, diversity, equity in the arts. And we are so pleased today to welcome our guest speaker, Maggie Miners. I was introduced to her work by Maggie Pino, who is also on the call today. When Maggie Miners' work was displayed at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And even it was mid-pandemic, and I only got a link to her online exhibition and was intrigued, and it has begun a journey that has culminated in bringing us all here together today. So thank you, Maggie Pino, for introducing me to Maggie Miners and allowing me the incredible opportunity to introduce Maggie Miners and her work to all of you. So without further delay, I will introduce Ms. Maggie Miners and just turn it over to her.
Thank you, Phyllis. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. I really appreciate it. And Maggie and Phyllis for putting this together and being so supportive of this work. I'm excited to be here, and I've had some really good conversations by email and by Zoom with Phyllis and Maggie by email, and hopefully we can carry on that conversation right now, today. And I'm going to share my screen, and we figured the best way to do this is that I'll just start talking about some of the pieces. And if you have questions, maybe if you know how to use the reactions, raise your hand or give a wave or something. I know some of you don't have your video on, but you can stop me at any time. And I am happy to, answer questions and all of that. So
Please feel free also, everyone, to use the chat. If you don't want to interrupt right then, and then I'll help moderate that and get the questions placed.
That's right. I won't see the chat, so you just have to stop me in whatever way you need to. So again, thank you very much for having me here. It's really an honor to be able to talk about my work. I conceived of this project back in 2010, and I was with my two young sons at the time at the Norman Rockwell Museum in, actually, I'm going to go forward. It's the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And we were talking about family and I'm sorry. Yeah, it must have been 2010. We were talking about family and what a family looks like. And we have a couple people in our family who are not heterosexual, and they were aware of that and started talking about Proposition 8 in California and what was happening during that time. And so this must have been in 2008. I'm sorry, I'm not getting the dates exactly right, but you get the point. And so my kids, who were fairly young at the time, were basically like, why does a judge get to decide who calls what a family? And I thought that was profoundly evolved of them to be able to think in that capacity, considering their own family and things like that. So we started having a conversation about chosen family and biological family and friends that you call family and things like that. And I turned to my husband and I said, wouldn't it be funny to reproduce this painting, Norman Rockwell's Freedom from Want painting, with Chuck and Gino at the head of the table? And Chuck and Gino are our very dear friends who had recently at the time gotten married in Canada. And my husband, Mike, was like, you should do that. You should do that. And I was like, oh, okay. And so it took a couple years to muster up the courage to actually make this photo. This was not the one I started with. The one I started with is not in the slideshow presentation, but I thought I would just start with the freedom. but this one is a freedom from want, and this was the inspiration for the entire collection. Um, I this one is called Freedom from Fear. And I made this one in around 2014, and it happened to be a summer of incredible violence in Chicago, especially among youth. Not among youth, but there were so many young men dying in the inner city and in certain neighborhoods that I felt so helpless. I live in the suburbs. It's an upper middle class suburb. I am very aware of my privilege, and I felt so helpless. I literally just did not know what to do. So the only way I could somewhat process this was going to the space of motherhood and recognizing that as a mother, you know, my concern is keeping my kids safe. And I know I only have so much control over that, but seeing what was going on in the inner city in Chicago was really, I just felt a connection there uh, from a motherhood component. And I asked a friend of mine if she would be willing to model for me with her two children, and she was very eager to do that. So I appreciate that. It wasn't as you know, I want to try to keep this in the scope of diversity and inclusion. And I forgot to mention that a lot of this project came from the place of trying to um, understand my world from my demographic, and that of, well, now I'm a middle-aged, upper middle class Caucasian woman, Christian woman. And that's not always the most comfortable demographic to own right now. But I think that holding myself accountable and educating myself and connecting with others and doing what I can to get a better understanding of the world based on my experiences is the best I can do. And this was how I was processing what was going on in the world around me at the time. I talked about this one a little bit. This is called the freedom of religion. And this was an interesting experience too. And this whole project, I'm not really going to talk about it technically, but what you should know is that it was like nothing I had ever done. My background is in photography. I had never photographed people before. And technically, this was way beyond my comfort zone, and yet I still had to do it. There was something inside me that was not going to sit still until I processed all of this and basically my space in the world and what does that mean. And so this particular one, all of the people in the image are Muslim Americans, meaning they were born in America and they are practicing Muslims. And it took me a while to come up with this concept because for a while, up until about 2015, I sort of felt that people had the freedom to practice their religions safely, other than isolated incidents over the years. I just felt in general there was pretty much acceptance, and that could be my naivete. I understand that. However, there was a rhetoric that started to overpower every other rhetoric, and it was very anti-Muslim. And I thought it was important to make an homage, if you will, to people that are actually Americans and vote in our elections and call this place their home. And I am embarrassed to say that I didn't know any Muslims, and that was a problem. So the universe had my back. I was at church one Sunday and there was a program announced about a gentleman that was coming to speak to the spiritual life group about being raised a Muslim in America. And I was like, I need to learn about this. So I went and it was really compelling and really interesting. And I introduced myself to him and I invited him out for coffee and told him about this project. And I said, I'd really love to make this picture. And you're the only Muslim I know, and I need help. And I need to make sure I'm not appropriating or I'm not being offended. My background is cultural anthropology. So I really try to be very sensitive to what I'm doing and not tell other people's stories. Um, but because I knew I would be able to talk about this work, and because he was such a fan of this idea, I decided that, he and I decided together that what I was trying to celebrate was in good faith. So he brought all these people here to the studio that you saw in the video, and they are his friends and family members. And he said, is there anything I need to bring? And I said, just bring yourselves and anything you use for prayer. And if any of the women have a hijab that resembles an American flag, I would love that too. And they all walked in, and here is this beautiful woman with this American, American type flag hijab. And I just was so overcome with um, gratitude. I just felt like it was the right thing. And I was so nervous about this. I remember shaking when I released this out into the world on social media. Um, it was a really interesting experience. And I got a lot of really positive feedback, especially from people in the Muslim community. And I got a lot of really negative feedback. And um, I still stand by this today. I think it's a beautiful photograph, and I think there's a lot to unpack in it. I just want to pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments at this point.
Can we stop screen share just a few seconds, Maggie, so that we can open up the
Yeah,
gallery
yeah.
view and allow people to see each other a little bit? We've had a
Yeah.
few later arrivals. Welcome to everyone who is with us today. We're so glad that you're here. And Maggie just alluded a few seconds ago to the video. And those of you who came in after I think it was 4:32 when we finished that little video, I think we kind of showed it before it started. It gives a little glimpse into Maggie's process. And my question is related to process, Maggie, and it was about that last image you just shared with us. So if it's okay, I'm going to share screen and get to that place in the video that we shared earlier that illustrates that your models that you brought into your studio. I'll go ahead and start this, but I'll mute my volume. The models that you brought into your studio to work and in creating these seem to be working in isolation, that you don't have the entire tableau, that you're capturing every face at the same time, that you are capturing an individual and then blending those photographic images together. And did you follow a similar technique in doing that for the image that you just shared with us?
I did. So I what I'm totally blanking on the word. I composited them. So in the real truth of it is, why don't I don't know if I can share it. Well, the one I just did, the freedom of religion, and then the freedom of speech, which I'll talk about next, have a lot of people in them. And I actually hired a photographer for those two. I did not photograph those. I was much more the director, the producer. I did everything but photograph. So because I didn't have the technical skills to pull that off, but what I did have was I knew all the models and I had to create a certain energy on the set and make sure people were comfortable with everything. So that was a real lesson for me in creativity and being an artist and letting go of control in some ways. And making this series really made me go from calling myself a photographer to calling myself a visual artist because I got to a place where, I realized it didn't really matter. It was really what I was trying to say. It didn't matter how I got there. And there are a lot of things, I have a lot of big ideas, and a lot of them I have no idea how I would ever execute, especially on my own. So it was a humbling experience in that regard. But my friend Nathaniel, he was the photographer. And so we sat together. You'd see me at the computer with him, and we sat together and I'd direct him and I'd direct the models, and then we'd composite it together. I mean, he'd physically do it, but I'd be like, no, move our head that way or that way. So it was really fun collaborative process, and we've actually done 2 additional shoots together around this series. So it's been fun.
Thank you, Maggie. Um, if you have any other questions, I invite you to unmute and just let your questions come out that way. If you have any audio issues or would you prefer to use the chat, you're invited to use the chat feature as well. Does anyone have any questions at this moment for Maggie? All right.
Oh,
So,
there is one in the middle.
oh,
Elizabeth?
oh, sure, Liz.
Hi, I can't remember if you addressed this or not, but I'm just kind of curious. Like, I was looking at the work with the Muslim men and women. It's beautiful. So I'm wondering if you were like, I'm glad to hear that you heard a lot of positive feedback from that community. I'm wondering if anybody like said anything about like what appears to be like men and women praying together, because you generally don't see that unless it is a very progressive sliver of a group,
That's
or
interesting.
possibly at Hajj. I think like Hajj is an exception. So I was just kind of curious because I was like, wow, look at that.
No one has ever asked me that before. I did not know that. But what I will tell you is I have a feeling that this is a very progressive group. Dawood, the gentleman that helped me with all of this, who came to our church to talk, we're in an interfaith group also. And so we
Cool.
had the privilege of going on this interfaith walk together, and we did a lot of talking about our childhoods. And I grew up Roman Catholic, and he grew up Muslim, and he, after the walk, he said, wow, I never would have thought I'd have so much in common with a woman that grew up Catholic, just like religiously oriented and
Mhm.
aligned, and maybe misaligned with the religious traditions, respective to each of ours. So the short answer is I didn't even consider that. I don't know enough about it, and it raises a really interesting question. And I'm going to guess that he didn't have an issue with it because he is quite progressive, and none of the people that seem to be within that community had any sort of issue. I mean, you can imagine the kind of people that did have an issue with it. Um, but no, I didn't know that. And thank you for bringing it to my attention because it's obviously something that could come up in the future. And like I said, I never mean any disrespect, but you just don't know.
Sure.
And you don't know what you don't know.
Oh,
So
absolutely. And I mean, like, there are, just because you're looking at something doesn't mean, I mean, you can like create a composition and overlap images, and that doesn't mean that they're meant to be taken literally as in the same space together. So it could be that people are looking at it and not necessarily interpreting it that way. So it was just something that I noticed. And thank you for answering my question. It's very interesting.
sure, thank you for bringing it up.
Yes, thank you. Are there any other questions that have occurred to you as Maggie shared a little bit of her work thus far and some of her process.
Okay, do you want me to keep screen sharing?
Yeah, go right ahead. That'd be great.
Okay. So here we go. Okay. Um, the next one. Okay, so this is the freedom of speech. And this was the last one I did, and I did it in 2016. And the big difference in this is that the audience is much more diverse in Rockwell's original one. And that was obviously very purposeful. And I never did this one because I didn't know how to process the freedom of speech. Like, it didn't really seem like an issue until it did. And there were some really loud voices in the room that seemed to overpower the majority, I think, in some ways. And so I put this together. It's purposely meant to be somewhat ambiguous. And I think, you know, I think it's one of those freedoms that I've certainly wrestled with in a lot of capacities. Um, I don't know how I feel about it today, to be honest, and I'm happy to hear what you have to say, but it is a very ambiguous picture. I will say the one really beautiful thing about it is if you see in the lower left-hand corner, there is a gentleman whose face you can't see, and you see a woman right above him with a hat on. The man to her left had arrived, he's a Muslim man. He had arrived from Egypt the day before to be united with his fiance, who is a friend of mine. And so he had just stepped onto American soil and was willing to participate in this. And I just think that says a lot of really wonderful things about America. And I think he's on his way to getting his citizenry, and he has a job, and he's like an engineer or something. Anyway, I just think it's a really beautiful story. Every single person I know in this photo, and it's just kind of cool. Like, I'm like, wow, maybe I have a little more diversity in my world than I thought I might have had. So it's cool in that way. So that was sort of nice. But the picture of a whole as a whole is meant to be somewhat ambiguous. And in Rockwell's, apparently the man who's standing in the photograph in the painting, apparently he's been interpreted as a worker, a laborer, and they're referring to his skin tone being a little darker than the men sitting down in the audience. So I thought that was sort of interesting, and I wanted to play on that as well. I don't know how valid that is, but I've read it in a couple places.
We do have one question in the chat, Maggie. I'll read it. I'm curious as to how you decided who would be the most emphasized person in this work. And while you're answering, I'm going to pull up the two images side by side.
Okay. I don't really think I thought that much about it. I think it was a much more intuitive process. These were all taken separately. Like, I knew who my cast was, if you will. And I knew where I wanted them placed. But I feel like it was much more intuitive than specific, if that makes any sense. I do know, yeah, that's really all I can answer to that. It was just an intuitive reaction.
Thank you for that question.
I have
Should
a
I-
question.
Yep.
It now that we're seeing the Rockwell version. My question was, did you ask the cast members that were sitting, did you ask them to look as if they were either disagreeing or surprised or shocked by what might be being said, did you ask them to have that kind of a reaction in
Yes.
their photograph? Yeah.
That I did. That I did because I think my general interpretation of what was going on with the world was a lot of people being like, what is going on? And being angry about the kind of speech and, you know, the falling back on this idea of we all get to express ourselves, which again, I said, I'm very conflicted about all of it. I don't believe that there's room for any hate. But just because I believe that doesn't mean that maybe people shouldn't be able to be in their bedrooms and say what they want. You know, I don't know. It's very confusing to me. So yes, I did direct those specific expressions.
Because in the Rockwell version, they look like they're really agreeing with whoever is speaking. Which, I mean, I really am appreciating the way you treated it as much more current to what's going on in our time.
Yeah, thank you.
Publicly.
I feel like the one lady in the Rockwell one with the hat on, because I think she sort of looks a little questioning, but the lady with the hat in the Rockwell one, I feel like she sort of is giving him a little bit of a side eye, but in general, yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I really try to modernize. I tried to modernize everything in some way.
Excuse me,
Okay.
sorry, could I add a quick comment to that?
Mhm.
Just that it's very interesting just in terms of, I need to turn my video on, sorry. It's just very interesting. The tiniest tilt of a head creates all kind of expressions. And so I think that's one reason that it is ambiguous. So someone could be seen as angry, but again, they could just be turning their head and the way the light hit. I'm thinking it's a man in front, the way the light hits his cheekbones. So I just wanted to add that makes it even more complex. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So this was an arduous process. It took about 8 years, and I initially had 18 of them and turned the valve off. I was sort of emotionally exhausted from all of it. And then this summer, we had a leak in the Supreme Court. And at the time I was in Germany. So that was a very interesting experience to be over there in like 17th century villages when this was all happening in America. Again, just didn't even know how to process it. And I was like, well, I know what I have to do. And what caused me to do this one that I've named Saving Liberty. The original one is called Miss Liberty. I pretty much flipped this one on its head. Rockwell was celebrating women in the workforce and all of that. I read an article in the Chicago Tribune about how this turnover of Roe versus Wade was going to particularly impact women of color. And again, just, you know, I was not alive during the first, you know, in the I was born in the 70s. I was not an adult in the 70s. So I wasn't part of the first wave of feminism or whatever wave that was, but I've heard a lot about how it was not very inclusive. And again, I get uncomfortable necessarily trying to tell other people's stories, but I had to process this. Like I'm like, great, not only is it an attack on women, it's an attack on women of color. And this is not fair. Like, it's just, we're all gonna have to continue to work harder and continue to fight for the same things we've been fighting for 50 years, if not more. So I put this together. And I did a shoot with Nathaniel, who had done the other 3 with me. And I called a modeling agency. This one came together much faster than the other ones. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew I didn't have to photograph it. So that took a lot of anxiety and pressure off me. But what was so wonderful about this is I knew what I wanted the woman to look like. And I found her through a modeling agency. And I told the modeling agency, I said, this is, somewhat of an activist, political, there's some social, connotations to it. And I need you to tell your model, because if they're not okay with it, I don't want them showing up and walking out the door, because I want to get this out there. And they're like, oh, sure, no problem. Well, the model shows up. Her name is Ebony Miller, and she's just such a wonderful person and just great energy. She shows up. I tell her what the shoot is about. And she's like, oh, this is perfect. I was just elected as a commissioner in my community. And I just thought that was so amazing to hear, just that, like, she's politically active, she's modeling as a side gig, she's willing to be engaged in this way. And I was like, you can use these pictures for anything you want. Like, thank you so much. Like, it just was such a great way to connect with someone that I normally would not connect with. And so that was wonderful. It was a grueling shoot. It was very hot in my studio. All of that stuff was really heavy. There was a lot of equipment. It was tough, but we did it and we got it out there. And people have really appreciated it.
Are there any questions or observations about that last work before we move on?
Yes, it's Alice. I just think overall that the RIDE committee in a way is about the political in art. And I think there's a lot of discussion that goes on in the art world about should art, quote unquote, should art be political? If it's political, is it really art? And I think you answered that question. It obviously is, but at the same time, I think maybe at another meeting, maybe that would be a topic of discussion, is what does it mean as an artist, or especially these days as an art teacher, to put yourself out there politically. Thank you.
That's a good point. I never really, I was doing this entire project for myself to figure out where I fit in the world and how I can be of more use in the world. And so this entire project has totally kind of created a life for itself just by exhibiting it in various places, and people like Maggie and Phyllis being able to use it and stuff like that. And so I actually personally don't consider myself an activist artist, but I think, it's almost impossible for the personal not to become political today. And that would be a really interesting program, because I consistently, unfortunately, all my art starts with me and what I'm trying to resolve, but I'm part of this bigger world, and it ends up having a broader conversation. So I do think that's very interesting point, and would be an interesting topic of conversation. I'd certainly love to talk about it. Okay, this next one I did, it's called Title IX. I did this, back in the 20 teens or something. And I was a high school athlete, and I started the ice hockey team at my high school. And I just was like, this isn't fair. There are 3 men's hockey teams and no women's hockey teams, like, not happening. So I've always felt strongly about women being in sports. So this isn't really much different than Rockwell's, other than you've got a woman standing there, or a young woman. And today that may as well be, it could be a man. So like, or a young man. So it's sort of interesting that in some ways, given when I did this, it might've been 2013. It's a little bit ambiguous today, but it is called Title IX. So that could give that away. And let me know if I'm going too fast. I'm keeping track of the time. This one is called Girl Interrupted, and it's one of the first ones I did. It was a little easier to do, one model, a simple set. And I was really struggling at the time with media. That's when it was sort of when social media was really picking up, and Snapchat and Instagram and all that stuff, and the idea of beauty standards. And I do not have, I have two boys, but I have nieces, and having, identifying as a woman, I certainly had a childhood and a girlhood, but from what I had heard in conversations, with friends and things like that, there's the loss of innocence and girlhood is happening earlier and earlier. And I blame social media, and I love fashion magazines. I love them growing up. But I really feel for these young girls today. And I was leafing through a fashion magazine, and that's a picture. I think that might be Katy Perry, and she's really goth. And I was like, I think that's interesting. Like, this isn't a fashion magazine, and it's not necessarily about beauty, but it's about expression, and it's, that kind of thing. So again, it's a little ambiguous, but at the same time, just having this conversation about social media, girlhood, magazines, this sort of discarded doll that, I mean, maybe today as a parent, people don't even want their children playing with dolls. I know Barbies have been controversial for like the last 15 years. And like, that was such a big part of my childhood, but I was never like, ooh, I need a body like Barbie. I just like to like play with her hair and make up different dramatic scenes. So it's just so, I think it's important for me to keep at it and keep trying to understand where these minds are going based on current events and things like that. Okay, the next one is called Captain Carey, and I think it's a pretty iconic Rockwell painting of Rosie the Riveter, again, celebrating women in the workforce. And again, Chicago Tribune headlines. And I was aware of this, Women in Combat. This is a childhood friend of mine. And she actually served in Afghanistan. She's a veteran, front lines. And I asked her if she would model for this, and she was so happy to do it. Her dad is also a veteran, and they came over to my house. I did this one in my house, and that's her uniform and her gold star, and that is not a real assault rifle. The interesting thing about this is, I will tell you that I had some of this work up at one of the galleries that represents me, which is not too far from the Highland Park shootings that happened over the 4th of July this year. And we took this down because we just felt that it was too close to the tragedy, and we just didn't want it to be a trigger. And I bring that up because some of these have been censored in different venues that I've shown the work. And I joked with my husband the first time my work got censored. I was like, wow, I guess I really am an artist now. I have a little bit of pride in the censorship, not for this particular one, to be honest, but some of the other ones, I have a little bit of pride. The freedom of speech one was censored at a venue. So I was kind of proud of that. But so it is interesting. Like the idea of censorship is really real, and I have experienced it, and I understand it from both sides. And this, it was just, we're still recovering from that. But I do celebrate Carrie, and she's just so generous with marching in every parade and speaking, and this always comes up on Veterans Day and Memorial Day, and it's nice. And we actually her family owns a local plumbing company, and she is sort of like the head of it, the boss lady. And so we work across the street from each other. So I'll like run to the grocery store and be able to say hi, and we see each other. So she has served in combat. The next one, this one is very loaded. I call this Dream Act. I took it in 2015 when there was discussion under the Obama administration about the future of DACA and what was going to happen to all of these people that were born here, but their parents weren't. And I don't understand all of it. I didn't pretend to, but I was just like, wow, what would that visually look like? And again, processing it. And I did this. I took this and it's a completely different message than Ruby Bridges. I was really going for the visual appropriation, and I recognize that. And there have been some people that have spoken up against, against this image and saying that it's offensive to the Ruby Bridges one. And of course, I would never, that was not where I was coming from. But an interesting story about this one is that it literally went viral. A celebrity I know through a few degrees of separation was following me on Instagram and saw this picture, and she reposted it. And I again, for some reason I was in France this time, and she posted it when I was away, and there was something going on at the time in America. I don't remember exactly what it was, but probably not too different than what's still going on today. She reposted it. She credited me. She talked about the series Revisiting Rockwell. And I mean, the comments just exploded. And my cute son, who was like 12 at the time, was like on his Instagram, like defending the art and being like, it's a picture, it's art. Like, it was really cute. I took no offense to any of it, but I did think it was very, very interesting, because then another celebrity screenshotted it and reposted it on hers, and she's not an American celebrity, and she is I believe she might be Palestinian, or she's Israeli. She's an Israeli movie star, and she reposted it. She didn't credit me. She didn't, like, you didn't know it was art. And so and I don't, I understand. I really try to credit everyone. I get it. I don't need the accolades. But the importance of crediting me in this was to show people that it was art. And I mean, people really blasted her. There were border control agents on her thing, like, that's not our uniform. And we would never do that. We would never hold our hands like that. So it was an interesting experience. But again, I was really coming from a personal place of just trying to figure out, like, what on earth is going on, and what would this look like, and how does this look? And, there's still a lot of discomfort around this. So Phyllis, are there any questions or comments at this point?
I don't see any listed in the chat at all. But I'll open it. Is there anyone else who has a question or a comment about this particular piece or the one that preceded it? Hearing none.
Okay, I'll keep going.
All right.
So I did this one. Both of my kids were Boy Scouts for a little bit of time. They were a bit unruly, so we had to try a few different things. And at the time, a lot of conversation. I did this in maybe 2012, 2013. A lot of conversation in the papers about the leaders of the Boy Scouts and what they should and should not look like and be doing. And I had a real issue with that. They now allow girls and female identifying people into the Boy Scouts. They call it Scouts now. I think they took the boy out. But so I just redid that and threw a rainbow patch on the uniform, and I put it out there. And I actually didn't really care what the Boy Scouts thought of it. And a lot of these, some people are like, are you worried you're going to get sued? And, I mean, the Rockwell estate's really litigious and, you know, they're really tough on licensing. And this is all original work that I've made. I mean, these are photographs that I've made. So it is my work. So I'm not really that worried. I did have someone, not from the Boy Scouts of America organization, but I did have someone, it must have been someone involved who had a son or something, ask me about this. And they're like, I couldn't find this uniform anywhere. Like, where did you get it? Like, and I had to explain that it was a piece of art. And I was really happy that he was looking for that uniform and to contact the office. So again, I was just trying to process some of this idea of diversity and inclusivity and where it lacked in my life and where I could maybe help advocate from a personal experience, without trying to be a savior in any way. And you know, this young man babysat my kids, and his mom's a good friend of mine, and she's actually the one that encouraged me to go ahead and do this whole project and said she'd help. So it's near and dear. And you know what? He came out a few years later, which I really love. So I feel like in a little way, the universe, it was a little bit of a, pardon the expression, but a little bit of a God wink, that he probably felt validated in some way that I was making this. I actually haven't talked to him about this particular picture, but you know, when he comes home someday, I will. And that leads me to this one, which the original one is called uh, Girl Outside the Principal's Office or something along those lines. And I changed it to Pride. And this is one of my children. And I said, I got him like at the perfect ripe age where he was just like not overly conscientious and or self-conscious, I should say. And he posed for me. And I explained a little bit and I said, oh, you know, so and so, and you know how he talks about wanting to be a girl. Well, I thought we could make this and celebrate that idea. And he was down. He liked it. He was familiar with the situation, and he made this picture with me, and I called it Pride because at the time I knew a number of young people who were thinking about transitioning to I don't genders or identifying as genders that they were more comfortable with. And when they made that decision, I could see a real energetic shift in their lives, just this feeling of surrender and being at peace and being free of a constraint that was bestowed upon them, either biologically or socially. So there was a lot of pride in them. And that's why I named it this. I did get a little pushback from some, well, from one member who was a reviewer at a photography event who was part of the LGBTQ community. She felt that in a way I was mocking it. And I said, you know, I can certainly see why you would think that, but that wasn't my intention. So I do want to make that very clear. It was fully in support. And, you know, I think a lot of art making sometimes takes risks. And I'm willing to take those risks because I'm always willing to learn and talk about it. And I'll get to that in a minute. I have one more that I was going to share. And this is called Selfies. And Rockwell has one called the Triple Self Portrait. This was very challenging. I had an assistant on the set with me, and it was hard to do, but and it's like really hard to look at. I really don't like looking at this, but I felt like it was essential. And you know, at the time I was commenting on selfie culture and just what it's doing to, you know, women, fashion, men, everybody. Like just it's kind of crazy. Um and over time I've begun to realize that I think subconsciously it's a great way to wrap up talking about this work in experiences like this, because the human side of it for me is just constantly asking me, like, asking myself, where do I fit in the world and how can I be of service and kindness and tolerance to others? And, holding myself accountable for the things that um, I might misconstrue or not understand or mistake or any of those, and being willing to be in difficult conversations about things that are going on. And that means listening to people whose voices sometimes are really hard to listen to, because at the end of the day, how I see it and what gives me peace is that, you know, if there's a little bit of being heard, if I can hear people who are trying to be heard and reiterate what I'm hearing them say, not agreeing and not validating, but maybe reiterating what I'm hearing them say, perhaps it'll just lower, lower the energy that can be out there. So I really thought about this in terms of diversity and inclusion and like where I fit in the world. And I don't really have an answer other than I'm still seeking and I'm still working on it. And it's a journey. And I'm excited. I'm really excited to be able to do my art and be able to talk about it. And the people I meet, I mean, I do have a very diverse community through the arts and through some spiritual practices, and it's just like a really beautiful thing because it opens my world, and I have so much more of the world to learn about and see and combat with and be at peace with. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. I know we have a few minutes, so I really, again, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and it's been really wonderful experience.
And we want to thank you, Maggie, as well. There was a question posted in the chat from Amy that was just asking a logistical question about using a watermark on your images for social media use. And if you've ever considered that, here, I'll read it out so don't you can see
Yeah.
it. All right.
That's a good question. I sort of feel like social media is so out of my control. I mean, it's like if I put it out there, I have completely lost control of it. And I'm okay with that. I mean, if there's something blatantly that's being stolen from me, I will address it. Um, I'm too scared to do a Google search of my images. Like, I don't know. Like, I feel like whatever's supposed to find me in that realm will find me when it's supposed to. So I don't watermark my work. I do sign the work that I sell through galleries and to collectors and museums and things like that. But as far as social media, I mean, I'm just giving it up to the universe there. I don't like that. But with the freedom of religion one, I will tell you that I did a little social experiment with Facebook, and I spent $10 and did a targeted post, and I picked cities like Miami and San Francisco and New York. And all my trolls were like people from Mississippi and North Carolina, and there were big rifles and flags and things like that. And I was like, what? How does this even work? So that was a very interesting experiment. I was like, all right, well, I'm never paying for an ad again. And like literally, I just have no control over any of it. So I'm just going in good faith at this point. But that's a good question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from those who are on the call today? Amy,
Hi.
raising her hand again.
Yeah, to kind of touch base on that, what I more or less was kind of asking was, you had mentioned earlier about the image with the guards. about how, someone you did know shared it and was like supportive and tagged you, or at least like represented you in a nice way. And then someone that was from another culture, another country, that didn't know the background of the image. And it kind of got you blasted a little bit on, like, without them knowing the context. So I was just wondering, like,
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like, it's a little bit like Emily Post's etiquette. I think that like there is an etiquette around social media. And if you're going to borrow someone's image, so she took it from this one person, she should have like, like there's I think there's some control, but even the watermark on a social media image is going to be so small that I don't, I think the average person spends like 1/30th of a second on a post or something
Right.
like that. And but it goes to show, to your point about research and like drawing conclusions without spending time looking at the sources.
Right. And that's what I was kind of wondering, if, like, honestly, if they had just taken a little bit of time to research into it. And I just didn't know if that's something you kind of run into with the impact of your images on how that's, portrayed, and if you get more backlash because of that, and if it like kind of inspires you further to do the art more because you do get that, or if it kind of keeps you reining in a little bit from wanting to go those subjects.
Well, I will say that I feel like because of where I am in my career and my life, I am at a great, like, I can take risks with very little consequences. Like, I'm not going to like go do something that's going to land me in jail, but just in terms of my expression and maybe poking the sleeping bear a little bit. So I'm not afraid to take risks, but in that capacity, but I'm not going to do it if I feel like my family will be in danger or something like that. But I'm willing to take repercussions in the sake of my expression about things, which is where this very human idea of like, what is freedom of speech, So it's like kind of a very broad, I get what you're saying. And I think a watermark or whatever, like, but I don't think generally people are paying that much attention to those things that
Right.
we as artists and creatives and educators and things like that think about.
So would you have then insight on, say, as a teacher, in letting your students have that freedom as well without a backlash of, of them wanting to have that freedom to touch such social topics like that?
So I was a teacher. I taught for 6 years at the middle school level, and I loved engaging with kids in that capacity. I had a little bit of a harder time with the system as a whole, which I'm sure you guys get in some ways. As a teacher, I would really just, yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's about mindfulness. It's about slowing down, not making impulsive reactions, considering the consequences to our actions. And like, as a student, research your sources, like research your sources. And when you're going to use the source, give credit. And I just think, that whole AI app that came out that is such a big concern with the writing of the essays. I don't know what it's called, but I just feel sorry so with the kids, it's like, I would say, yes, like express what you need to express, but consider why you need to express it and what potential consequences could happen by doing it. I mean, it's really, for me, it's much more about mindfulness and recognizing the purpose behind doing things. It's sort of a woo-woo answer, but I think it's just, we go at this really fast pace. And I think if when I take a breath and I, go into that space of the power of pause, a lot of my immediate reactions sort of simmer down. And I'm like, okay, maybe this isn't the best way to go about that.
Well, thank you. Appreciated.
Thank you for those questions. They're really good.
Yes. And the clock on the wall says that it is currently 5:31. And we had scheduled to go until 5:30 today. So I want to say thank you to everyone for participating And I'm going to flash up on the screen or add to the chat. I'll probably add it to the chat here in just a minute, or maybe Maggie can. Contact information if you would like to reach out to her. She has been very generous and sharing her contact information. It was on the screen earlier for a little minute. And all I want to say is that the Missouri Alliance for Arts Education is thrilled to have had the opportunity to welcome you here, Maggie. And we are able to do our work as a result of the donations that we receive, the contributions. And if you would like to see this kind of programming continue, you are invited to click the link that I just put into the chat and make a donation to the Missouri Alliance for Arts Education. And I just want to say thank you again, everyone, for coming. And thank you again, Maggie, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, both Maggie and Phyllis, for all your work, and all of you educators and artists out there. I feel you. I'm with you. Like, let's do this. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Everyone, have a wonderful evening. And as always, you can reach out to me if you have further questions or ideas for future artists you'd like to see featured in our IDEA quarterly sessions. My email address is director@moaae.org, and I'm putting it in the chat right now. Feel free to reach out. Everyone else, have a good night.